It's an honor to speak with you today about on this event. After 9/11, my students and colleagues and I tried to understand the events, how they impacted us, and what they possibly might tell us for the future. We were lucky to gain several grants from the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Mental Health, and we collected a great deal of data. Today, I will briefly share some of that research with you as a way of reflecting on the lessons we may have learned from those events. I'll be condensing a great deal of information into 5 points in a fairly short period of time. I want to begin with some photos. These are fairly disturbing photos. Nobody needs to be reminded of what happened on that day, but it's a good idea to remember the sequence of events. The event itself was shocking, audacious, and unprecedented. Nothing like it had ever happened before. And these images are indelible. They will be with us for the rest of our lives and for many lives to come, many generations to come. There are some shocking sights. For example, this image. People were trapped at the top above where the planes hit, and as you know, they could not be rescued. They were overcome by the heat. Many of them simply jumped. Anyone who was at the site that day had to see this. The people that we've interviewed in our research often talked about the sound that the bodies made as they hit the pavement. It's something that they will never forget. Then the towers fell. Nobody thought that that could happen. When they fell, thousands were killed instantly. Many others were injured. Many ran for their lives and survived that have that event to contend with. When it was over, the 2 gigantic towers were simply gone. The absence was a stark reminder of what had happened. As Bruce Springsteen put it in one of his songs, New York was left with an empty sky. Then there came the reckoning. Loved ones simply vanished. We searched and we mourned. We mourned individually, collectively, and globally. We had a lot of questions after 9/11. As researchers and social scientists, once the dust settled, we did what we knew how to do best. We tried to answer some of those questions. Now, 10 years later, we have some answers. There's still a lot of questions. There's still a lot of things we're trying to understand. But we do have some answers. We have learned a few things. Lesson number 1, really bad things do happen. This may sound obvious, even glib, but 9/11 opened up our eyes to the fact that the unthinkable can happen. Most of the world already knew this. Here in the US, the most powerful and probably the safest country in the world, somehow it didn't seem possible. There was a sense that the US was not vulnerable to such events. We've learned that that's not the case. As Jack Beatty, editor of the Atlantic Monthly, now famously put it, with 9/11, it was as if Americans were expelled from Disneyland. And this led to a gradual acceptance, I think, of the simple fact that really bad things do happen. Most of us, virtually all of us, are confronted during the course of our lives with the death of people we care about. Most of us are also exposed to many violent and life-threatening events. And this is a fairly interesting piece of science because we tend not to remember that. In the research we did after 9/11, both on survivors and on the students we've interviewed, we found that people often forget about the violent, life-threatening events they've gone through. We forget about pieces of the events. Survivors from 9/11 that we interviewed over time also forgot about pieces of the events. The memories became more benign over time. And this was primarily what healthy people did. This is what the people who coped well did. It's part of how we live with the world that we're presented with. And it's very natural. Lesson number 2 also may seem obvious. Disasters can cause very serious harm. But it may seem obvious, but 9/11 changed the way we think about disasters. Our expanded awareness allowed us to pay greater attention. In the years that followed, there were other disasters. For example, the Katrina hurricane, the disaster in the Gulf. There were also disasters that were many, many times more caustic in terms of destruction and loss of life. The terrible tsunamis in Southeast Asia, the devastating earthquake in Sichuan, China, and Haiti, the recent triple earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster in Japan. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives in these disasters, and these events continue to remind us what can happen. And these are the kind of things that the psychological sciences have documented: the psychopathological symptoms, behavioral problems, suicidal ideation, stress-related health problems that arise as a result of these events. So people suffer real psychological damage. The third lesson has been particularly hard for my profession to accept. We can't fix it right away. As much as we might like to, we can't simply march in and make things right. Prior to 9/11, it was widely assumed that when any event involved mass casualty, a shooting, a natural disaster, an act of terrorism, that the best thing to do was to quickly bring in mental health professionals for immediate crisis counseling, grief counseling, critical incident stress debriefing. It was assumed that everybody could benefit from this kind of approach, and it seemed to make sense. However, the research primarily after 9/11 has shown very clearly that it actually doesn't help people very much, and in many cases it makes people worse. The reason is that many people will be upset after such events, but there's something adaptive in that. The very distress that we feel, the emotion, the sadness and fear that we feel after these events is part of the reason why we're able to cope so well. These are very, very old responses phylogenetically. These go back to even non-human primates, and rodents have similar reactions. We have a cortex on top of them that allows us to do all kinds of other things. But those reactions are highly adaptive. They're functional. They do their job. And we can't go in simply and try to make those reactions go away. So the pain initially is actually very useful. We now know this. Sorry, I missed that slide. Not everyone reacts the same way. Many people will be deeply upset immediately after a horrible event. And as I said, this is only natural, but there's a great deal of variability in how much and for how long people will be upset. We quickly learned that traditional models we use for understanding loss and trauma were not quite adequate. Traditional models emphasized disorder and non-disorder, pathology or sickness and non-pathology. So everybody was pretty much lumped into one of two categories. And that approach tended to assume that psychopathology and dysfunction were the most common response. If we look at this graphically, which is how I like to understand these events, we have a PTE, which is the phrase we use for, instead of a traumatic event, it's a potentially traumatic event, which underscores the fact that events cause very different reactions. We have a continuum of time on the x-axis, and a continuum of functioning, or in this case, disruptions of functioning on the y-axis. If we have chronically elevated psychopathology, say somebody who had been in the disaster and cannot recover, it looks something like that. And this is the traditional model, and it tells us some things. It's a very useful model in the beginning of our attempt at understanding about these events. But it doesn't tell us where everybody else is. It simply lumps everybody else into this one very large category. And we just can't understand much about health in that case if it's just a big category. So if we can't understand health, we can't exactly understand ill health. And that was a big problem. It became a particular problem when we saw people down here who looked like they weren't reacting much at all. It was assumed that there weren't many people there, and that there was those people were either remarkably healthy, kind of like super copers, or there was something wrong with them. And countless times I've received emails and phone calls. I guess before email there was phone calls. Remember phone calls? And people would say, you know, I'm fine, and everybody keeps telling me that I'm not. There must be something wrong. I must have repressed my grief or something like that. And in fact, that was a very confusing endeavor for people. So this is where a lot of our research came in. We began to try to follow people over time, and we began to track the different patterns, and we saw something more like this. These patterns represent the prototypical trajectories we see and the relative frequency. Sometimes we see a few more, so it looks something like that. Now, this is a complicated slide, but it basically illustrates the fact that lots of different types of outcome, and they occur with relatively predictable frequency. And if you notice this area in the bottom of the graph, you can see that that is a trajectory of what we would now consider stable, healthy adjustment, people who go through these horrific events and are essentially okay, and you can see that it's actually fairly common. So this leads to our fifth lesson, which is that we were stronger than we realize. In 2004, I published a paper in the Journal of the American Psychologist summarizing some of this work. And in that paper, I defined resilience as the ability of adults and children in otherwise normal circumstances who are exposed to an isolated and potentially highly disruptive event to maintain relatively stable, healthy levels of psychological and physical functioning, as well as generative experiences and positive emotions. This essentially means people who have been through something you would really dread, a really lousy event, and they're essentially okay. They continue functioning. They continue to concentrate and love the people in their lives. Generative experiences means that they can do new things. They can embrace new relationships. And what we found over and over was the resilient outcome was typically the most common pattern we saw, not the least common. It was not psychopathology, but resilience that was most common. These are data from 9/11 this is a study I did with Sandro Gallet and his team. Sandro is now chair of epidemiology at the Mailman School of Public Health in the medical school uptown. I was very fortunate to have the chance to work with him and his team because they're absolutely brilliant researchers. They did an incredible job here of collecting a representative sample of New Yorkers. This data set is a large representative data set. They used a random survey method. So this sample actually the demographics of this sample are almost identical to the 2000 census, which means this is a representative sample of New Yorkers. This captures the heterogeneity of New Yorkers. So what my part of this project was to look at mental health in terms of these different types of experiences. We call this exposure in my language. So these are different types of experiences that people had. And you can see the black bars represent the portion having PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. The purple bars represent people having a kind of mild to moderate trauma reaction, some trauma symptoms, but not psychopathology, not dysfunction. And the yellow bars represent people who are essentially symptom-free. They're not experiencing really any symptoms. They're continuing to function just fine after the event. But you can see that these are pretty severe levels of exposure. If we look at the third line from the top, people who were in the World Trade Center and got out, those people all ran for their lives. They saw carnage. They saw just remarkably horrible things in that day. Yet, and 1 in 4 of those people, there's a little red dot somewhere there, 1 in 4 of those people developed debilitating symptoms. Post-traumatic stress disorder means they were having a very difficult time functioning, yet more than half of those people were symptom-free and resilient. And this is something we've seen now across many, many events. This slide shows you a number of the different studies we've done at Teachers College. Most of these were done at Teachers College, and most of them were done after 9/11. And I'd like to point out that I've been blessed to have some remarkable students, some remarkable doctoral students in the clinical psychology program, and remarkable master's students we have working with us on these projects. So we have here four bereavement studies, several terrorist studies, a SARS study, traumatic injury, breast cancer surgery, hereditary cancer testing, job loss, divorce, birth of a child as a stressor event, and combat deployment. And you can see the resilient group on the left, the group with stable, healthy functioning, is always much more common than psychopathology and is often more than half of the sample. It's always the most common response. So across all these different studies now, we have seen the same proportion over and over. I like to point out that birth of a child and combat deployment show very similar numbers, which tells you something. So these are the 5 lessons, really, I think, that we've learned in a brief summary of some of the things we've learned after 9/11. The epilogue is that we still have a lot to learn. If we are so resilient, why are we so resilient? How does that work? This is a great question. It's something we're trying to understand now. And if most people are resilient, why isn't everybody resilient? What's going on there? So these are really the big questions we have now, and we're working on here at Teachers College in our lab. We've just recently received a very nice grant from the National Institute of Health to continue this work. We have just briefly, a couple good ideas. One is something I mentioned to before, is our innate emotion system. We really have this fine-tuned emotion system that does a very good job of helping us adapt. And again, it suggests that the very distress and upset that we feel initially is the reason we're able to cope so well. It's a long story. I would love to tell you that story. Some other time I'll tell you that story. Another factor are resources, particularly community resources. Social interactions are the key. And prior to 9/11, there was very little interest in community resources. But communities take care of themselves. But unfortunately, we don't really know how they do it. And more importantly, we don't know how to make that better. So there's a lot of interest in that right now. It's a very tricky thing to measure, but there's a great deal of interest in trying to understand communities. The World Health Organization is interested in communities. A lot of global work is aimed at this issue. And finally, one of my favorite topics is laughter and smiling. We code laughter and smiling from the face, and miraculously enough, people who've been through the worst hell on earth are still able to laugh and smile. And we get genuine laughter and smile. We can code muscles near the eyes that contract pretty much when there's a genuine positive experience. And we see this in everybody all the time, even when they've been through the worst kind of hell. And it tends to predict who will cope better in the long term. So for me, this is very hopeful because it means that we can feel pain and anguish, but it's not the only thing we feel. It means that we don't have to let go of those positive experiences we have. And laughter and smiling in particular about connection to other people. I want to close in that vein with a quote from Frank McCourt. Many of you know that Frank McCourt was a longtime New York City teacher, and he was a much beloved author of 2 best-selling memoirs, Tis and Angela's Ashes. On the 2nd anniversary of 9/11, he was interviewed on the Brian Lehrer show on WNYC, and they asked him to comment on 9/11. Frank passed away 2 years ago, but this quote is still as relevant today as it was then, and you can hear his brogue in this quote. We want to honor those who have passed, but we don't want to hear the drums all day. We don't only want the bagpipes. We want some jazz too. We want to hear the children sing and play. Thank you.